Okay, welcome everyone to this week's OCTF seminar. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest for today, Forrest Fleischman, who's an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. And he did his PhD in Indiana with Eleanor Ostrom, and then did a postdoc at Dartmouth College and spent a few years teaching at Texas A&M before moving to his position at Minnesota. And the seminar is a joint seminar with the Oxford Centre for Tropical Forests and the Oxford India Centre for Sustainability. So it's lovely to co-host the seminar. And so thanks for joining us, Forrest, and over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Just want to make sure everyone hears me good.
That's good.
All right. So I was just looking at the list of names, and I see I have some old friends here, along with a lot of people whose I've never met, but whose work I admire and have followed for years. So that's pretty fun. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to share my screen. All righty. So, all right, let me make sure I can see everything. So I want to start with this picture of my study area in India, which I want to highlight a few points about that I'm going to circle back to. First of all, this is in the foothills of the Himalayas. It's quite mountainous, and many of the mountains are covered with forest, as you can see in this background here. And in the foreground, I want to point out that there's some kind of pinkish orange flowers right here, right under where I put my email address. And that is an invasive species called lantana. And then I want to point out that down in this valley and up on some of these hills, there are villages, and the villages are also full of trees. So I'm going to return to that point towards the end. Before I go any further, let's see, how do I advance? Okay. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that the empirical work I'm going to present today is based on a whole series of collaborations with a large number of people, many of whom are in this photograph here. This was sort of our primary data collection team as of 2018. Some of these people are still working for us today, collecting data. Actually, we have a project looking at the impact of COVID on these forests. So some of the same people are still working with us. And there's also a wide number of other people not in the photograph who I've collaborated with on various analysis of the data. So I just want to acknowledge that this is sort of a team effort, but I'm going to stitch together a bunch of different pieces into one presentation. And that stitching together is my work, not the work of my collaborators. So if I have any very controversial opinions, they're mine, and not necessarily those of my collaborators. But this has been a great group of people to work with. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to begin by giving an overview of forest restoration as an emerging global priority. And I realize there's probably a variety of knowledge bases in this audience, but I want to make sure we're all up to speed on why this is an important topic today, and the role social science might be playing in this. I'm then going to zero in on my study sites in the Indian Himalayas and the state of Himachal Pradesh. And I'm going to talk about some restoration programs that haven't been very successful. And I'm going to look into why. Some of this, I saw that a member of my PhD committee is here. So some of this will be a repetition to that person, because some of this goes back to my doctoral work, looking at why restoration programs in India aren't working. And some of it has to do with the relationship between these programs and local needs and governance. And I'm going to wrap up with some thoughts about how social science can better serve this global agenda of restoration. So why do we care about restoration today? Well, land cover and land use change account for 20% of total historical carbon emissions, 20 to 25% depending on which data source you're looking at and how you're doing the analysis. And so if we're going to address climate change, we need to address land. And land has lots of other values. So land also, in addition to storing carbon, intact ecosystems are important for biodiversity. They protect our watersheds, and they provide a wide variety of other benefits to people. I think in my mind, and particularly thinking about India, hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people rely on natural ecosystems to meet their daily livelihood needs. So if we have more and better ecosystems, we might have more environmental incomes for those people. And we know that a lot of land out there that has been converted out of natural ecosystems, or that's still sort of in a natural state but degraded, might be available to restore to a more natural state to provide benefits to people and to nature. I want to emphasize that it's not really clear how much land there is available for this, but it's a significant amount of land. And this has attracted global attention. We're in the first year of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and there's a wide variety of existing initiatives that focus on forest restoration. The Bond Challenge is a prominent one. It dates back about a decade, and the current challenge is to restore 350 million hectares of degraded land and deforested landscapes by 2030. And to give you a sense of the scale of 350 million hectares, that's the size of India as a whole. Not that this is an international pledge, but it's restoring a land area equivalent to the entirety of the country of India over the next decade. And a wide variety of countries are involved in this. And we just saw that earlier this month at the Conference of Parties in Glasgow, a lot of new pledges were made for various kinds of forest restoration. And some of the people here, I imagine, were present at that meeting and might be able to go into a little bit more detail if it matters in the discussion about what those pledges are. But this is sort of a really big push with a lot of money behind it and a lot of interest from a lot of global players. Ecological restoration means changing human behavior. So in order to restore natural ecosystems, we need to eliminate whatever behavior caused that ecosystem to be damaged or converted. So sort of in a classic sense, maybe we have an agricultural landscape, we want to restore a forest there. Well, that means we have to get rid of agriculture, and then we have to create a new behavior, which is restoring and creating a forest. So ecological restoration is definitely an ecological phenomena, but it's also very fundamentally a social phenomena. And I put pictures here of our social science research team that we had in the field. These pictures are 3 years old. That's why we're so close to people and not wearing masks, interviewing a number of farmers in the Himalayan foothills. Right now, I'm working on a paper where we're analyzing publications in the journal Restoration Ecology. Restoration Ecology is the flagship journal of the Society for Ecological Restoration, which is the largest global society devoted to restoration. And one of the questions we're asking of the papers in this journal is, how do they integrate social science into the journal? How is the flagship journal of the main global association for restoration integrating social science? And the answer is they're largely not. We found very few empirical social science studies in this journal. There are some that are quite good, very high quality social science, but as a percent of the papers published, it's very small. We haven't completed this analysis, so I don't have the numbers, but I'm doing the analysis and I can tell you that we find very few of them. Interestingly, we find a lot of editorials in the journal saying, oh, we need to engage more with social scientists, but they're not actually doing it. On the flip side, so there's my critique of restoration ecology. On the flip side, my community, the social scientists, do not have a consolidated body of knowledge about restoration. There are widely scattered studies, insights from several related social scientific fields that are really relevant for restoration ecology. But I couldn't point you to a review paper or even where to look to get knowledge about the social science of restoration. In discussions, actually only about a month ago, with a bunch of people at the Forest Livelihoods, the FLARE meeting, we decided to create our own network. So if you go to z.umn.edu/restoration social science, you can sign up to join a mailing list we created. That's what's there right now. And I would encourage you to do it. I'll put that URL again up at the end of my talk. But we are trying to create a consolidated social scientific knowledge base about restoration. I don't think one exists yet. However, we've been studying forests and people very intensively for at least the last 30 years. I chose 30 years, which is the age of my mentor, Eleanor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, which has been very influential. But there's a wide variety of research that's been studying how forests and people interact, at least for the last 30 years. And this comes up with certain really consistent findings. The main threats to forests, the main drivers of deforestation and forest degradation, are the expansion of export-oriented commodity agriculture and the development of large-scale infrastructure. So if you look at the picture on the top, the top picture is a national highway in India that sort of bisects the country north-south. This is right in the center of India. And you see the sign, narrow lane ahead. It's my understanding that that sign doesn't exist anymore because they widened that highway for the next, I would say about 20 or 30 kilometers. That highway goes right between two national parks. So that's going to contribute to forest degradation. There's going to be more access to that area. It's also going to isolate the wildlife populations of those two national parks. And that fellow standing next to the sign is a wildlife biologist who was studying how animals, tigers, monkeys, etc., are moving across this road. It's a major barrier to wildlife movement. It was already a major barrier as a little 2-lane road. Now as a 4-lane big highway, it'll be much more of a barrier. Underlying this expansion of export-oriented commodity agriculture and development of large-scale infrastructure is pervasive land tenure security and power differentials between the state and big businesses that are the beneficiaries of export-oriented commodity agriculture and the development of large-scale infrastructure, and the rural forest dwellers and users who often do not benefit from this infrastructure, and who often are positioned to take care of and defend the forest. And so the next point on this slide is a really consistent finding, is that indigenous and forest-dependent people can manage forests sustainably when they're given collective management rights over those forests. There's a paper that I just saw in one of the nature journals last night. I saw someone posted a Twitter thread. So if you look up my Twitter, it's the last thing I retweeted. New paper out looking at the performance of indigenous lands when compared to government protected areas and unprotected areas around the world. And the main finding, consistent with what we found in studies for decades, is that indigenous and forest-dependent people manage lands, protect forests as well or better than governments. And we've also found that government protected areas perform better when local participation is greater. At the same time, I want to emphasize that incentives and support to local people matter. So we also find that when we have programs like payments for ecosystem services, often that incentivizes people, all kinds of people, to conserve forests. We also find that when local people are given management rights, but they lack resources, they often don't do as good a job at managing those. Similar to what we find with government-run protected areas, which is to say that when government protected areas don't have resources, they also do not work well. Unfortunately, forestry programs often fail to incorporate these insights because they're inconvenient, frankly. Saying that it's poor, rural, indigenous people who might be the key to forest conservation is a hard thing for a national forest minister who maybe wants to enhance the power of his own agency. It's a hard thing for them to hear, and it's a hard thing for them to do. And there are powerful interests opposed to forest conservation everywhere that I've ever worked. So now I want to zoom into India, and I want to start by explaining to you why I think India is a really good place to study forest restoration. And the answer is in this chart, which I reproduced from a paper by Nature Ravindranath from about 15 years ago. And the chart shows the cumulative area forested. So these are government-run tree planting programs, which is the predominant form of forest restoration practiced in India to this day. And what you see is that really starting about 1980, there was a huge investment in India in these government-run afforestation programs. The total area afforested as of the time of this paper, so this is data up to 2005, was about 35 million hectares. You might recall on a previous slide, I said India is about 350 million hectares. So over this time period, really about 1980 to 2005, the government of India afforested an equivalent of 10% of the land area of India. This is a really huge investment. And if we had up-to-date data, I have not been able to figure out I'm not 100% confident in this graph because I can't find reports on which it's based. So I haven't been able to update it, but we can say that we're pretty confident that this has continued. And there've been this photograph that is my photograph on the side shows that I took this photograph actually in a government forestry training center about a decade ago. And it shows that there were different waves of planting. So there's a period in which tropical pines or eucalyptus were popular. There was a period in which so-called social forestry was popular. And then this picture says, now we're in the age of joint forest management. Now I want to zoom in a little bit further. Let me just say, one of the critiques of studies of forest restoration is they tend to be done right after the restoration happens. And we don't know the outcomes. Trees take a long time to grow. One of the advantages of doing this in India is we can look at trees planted in the 1980s and 1990s. Those trees should be mature now. We should be able to really capture what the benefits and impacts of those plantations were. And the place we chose to do this was Kangra district in the Indian state of Himachal Pradesh, which, as you can see in the little inset map of India, is in the northern part of India. As you can see in the photograph, this is the foothills of the Himalayas. The snow peaks are called the Daladar range, and they are the first major range. They're not the they're not the Great Himalaya range. They're kind of the foothills of the Great Himalaya range, but they're, as you can see from the picture, quite big. But the forests we're going to look at are more in the foothills in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 meters. And you can see in this picture that there are extensive forests in this district. We were able to obtain extensive data from the government of Himachal Pradesh on their afforestation activity. And so what you can see in this graph is afforestation activity from 1979 to 2015. And I want to point out a few things. First of all, as I said, it's good to evaluate forest restoration decades after it happened, because that's when you should start to see benefits. Trees take a long time to grow. The peak time for planting trees in Himachal Pradesh was from the mid-1980s till about 2000. That's when they were doing the most. As you can see, they're doing much less than they were back then. At that time, and continuing to this day, the focus of these government-run tree planting programs that we're going to be looking at in detail was on improving forest cover for environmental and social goals. So sometimes when people hear tree planting, they're thinking about the kinds of tree planting that we might have here in the state of Minnesota, where it's, we're tree plantations for industrial purposes. Maybe we do a clear cut, then we replant the trees and grow them for 20, 30, 50, 80 years, and then clear that forest again and replant in order to generate industrial products. Commercial harvest of timber has been banned in the state of Himachal Pradesh since 1986. So right around the time when this tree planting wave was taking off, the government, the national government and the government of Himachal Pradesh said, these forests here are too valuable to people as standing forests to allow commercial timber harvest here. So these are forests that are only managed for goals like watershed protection. This is the headwaters of important rivers that water the Indo-Gangetic Plain. People here are dependent on forests for a variety of goods and services. And so we want more forests here. That's the goal. This data is from a paper which I'm still working on. So now I want to break this data up. And now you'll see there's black bars and gray bars. The black bars are plantations that were done through government-run participatory programs. If you're familiar with India, this would in particular be programs like social forestry and joint forest management. So these are programs that aim to involve local people living near the forest in planning and management of forests and trees. The gray bars are the bars of the sort of traditional, what we call state-led plantation drives, in which there is no formal mechanism for involving local people in decision-making or management. And I want to point out that the government of India tends to say that all our forestry is participatory. We involve local people in everything. And our analysis of this data, I think, pretty clearly shows that that's not the case. And it wasn't the case except for a brief period in basically around 1990, when joint forest management was really big. Except for those maybe 5 years around 1990, it's always been that there's more planting being done without direct local participation than with direct local participation. However, there have been a lot of changes in these programs over time. And I want to direct you to the sharply downsloping graph in the top left of my slide, which is the planting of cheer pine, which is Pinus roxburghii. Just so you know, the y-axes on these graphs are not the same. So the peak number of trees planted of cheer pine, and I think it's 1985, they planted 14 million cheer pines. No other species has ever planted more than about 6 or 7 million in a year. So cheer pine is by far the most planted species in this landscape. And the picture on the lower right of my slide shows a cheer pine plantation. So this is a native species of pine. It's good for commercial lumber. It's also tapped for resin, for pine resin. And I don't know if you can make out on that slide, depending on what the resolution of the image you're getting, but that forest was just burned. That plantation was just burned. Cheer pine is a really fire-adapted species. To me, it looks just like the red pine and ponderosa pine that we have here in North America, which are also very fire-adapted pine species. You'll see cheer pine planting has declined greatly over the time period that we study. The other three species here, Ker, Deodar, and Robinia, are the next three most popular planted species that we found in our database. Deodar is a cedar, and the top, beautiful cedar, and the top picture is a picture of a deodar tree. It's also very good for commercial lumber production. It grows at higher altitudes than the cheer pine. And again, you see that these most commonly planted species are mostly declining, and these are mostly commercially useful species. They are mostly not species that are used by the local people for their livelihoods, but are used for, in the example of cheer pine and deodar, for commercial lumber. And again, remember, commercial timber harvest was banned in 1986. I advanced that slide before I was ready, but here we go. So some of you may have already seen our paper we published a couple months ago in Nature Sustainability. This is the headline of that paper. We looked, so the red line in these graphs is the year that a plantation was planted. And what you should see after that is increasing forest cover. So on the top graph, the y-axis is showing the percent of the plantation area classified as dense forest. So as a plantation grows, we should see more of the area classified as dense forest. We don't see that. In fact, although it's statistically indistinguishable from zero, the trend is actually a decline. But essentially what we're seeing here is there's no effect on forest cover from tree plantations in this landscape. We can also look at the effect on species composition. And this bottom graph shows the percent of the plantation area classified as broadleaf trees. Now, I want to point out there's two reasons we're going to look at the percent broadleaf. And the first reason is that it's easy to measure. So this is based on Landsat imagery. The pixel size is pretty large. We like Landsat because we were able to find cloud-free images of the site going back to 1990. There's no other image source that we were able to do that with. But the problem with Landsat is it's pretty coarse. We can't tell that much about the forest, but we can tell, is the forest predominantly broadleaf or needle-leaf? So it's an easy thing for us to measure. The second reason we care about it is it just so happens that in this landscape, if we go back to the slide, the two most commonly planted species are needle-leaf species, not broadleaf species. And so it turns out that broadleaf species is a pretty good proxy for species that are useful in the local economy to local people. The main things that local people use trees for in this landscape are firewood, grazing, and fodder for sheep, goats, and cattle. And many broadleaf species make good firewood and or have edible foliage that cattle and goats can eat. Pine and cedar are not particularly good firewood and don't have edible forage. So what we see in this graph here is in the years after plantation, not terribly surprising given what I showed you on the previous slide, broadleaf cover is decreasing. So on the one hand, plantations aren't increasing forest cover, which was one of the goals. On the other hand, plantations are decreasing the utility of the forest for local people. And it also turns out there probably, we haven't done this work as carefully, but other work in this landscape shows that biodiversity is also positively correlated with percent broadleaf cover. So a lot, for example, if you have a native oak forest in this region, the diversity of bird species or whatever is going to be much higher in that native oak species than in a native oak forest than in a native pine forest. So this doesn't look very good. It turns out that we can understand a lot of what's happening by looking at the sites that are selected for planting. Now, this previous data, to get old plantations, there's no shapefile of where they were planting trees in 1990. We had to go into villages and ask older people who are experts on forests around their village, take us to all the plantations that you know about that have ever happened here. And we had a team of people that walked the boundaries of those plantations with GPS units. So that's how we were able to get about 1,200 plantations mapped with varying levels of detail. We have about 400, which we have the complete shapefile for. It's very hard work because this is a very mountainous place. So oftentimes it's very hard to actually walk these boundaries. But for very recent plantations, 2016 to 2019, we were able to obtain a complete shapefile, which gives us detailed location information. And so we don't know the outcomes of these plantations yet. They were just planted in the last few years. We have a paper under review where we analyze where these plantations were being planted. And 38% of the plantations are in forests that are already dense, already have dense forest cover. That's kind of interesting. Almost 40% of the plantations are going in sites where there's already dense forest cover. We could come up with two reasons why this might happen. The first reason might be a good reason. Maybe those dense forest cover sites are places like monoculture pine plantations, and they're going in there and they're planting other species and making them more diverse. Unfortunately, the species that they're planting are not very diverse. So that may be a goal, that may explain part of this 40%, but it's probably not being very effective because they're only planting these relatively few very common species that are already common on the landscape, like pine and deodar. 48% of plantations were targeted in areas where there is not currently forest. Oh, I should say, well, I'll say 48% are planted in areas that are not currently forest. This could be a good thing as well. Maybe these are good places to restore forests, but it could be a bad thing. It could be that we're planting in places like steep, rocky, south-facing slopes where maybe those areas are naturally some kind of open savanna or scrubland, and they're not actually good places for forest growth. So we don't know, but in both cases, there could be a rhyme and reason to this, or it could be that we're just looking for places to plant trees, and there aren't that many of the places that we think trees should definitely be going, which are areas of degraded forest, where increasing the density of species of trees would clearly work well. So my colleague, Pushpendra Rana, who's actually a government official in the state of Himachal Pradesh, built a model looking at past land cover changes in this region using machine learning. I'm not going to go into all of it. It's in a paper that we just resubmitted, actually. And he basically built a model of the probability of future forest cover loss based on past forest cover loss. And we found that 60% of the spending on plantations was to plant trees in places where based on past trends, the probability of experiencing tree cover loss was greater than 50%. So it seems like a lot of these plantations are going into places where either their benefits might be minimal, like in an already dense forest, or where it's likely that the trees won't survive, like I mentioned, a steep south-facing rocky slope. And finally, I'll just note from this that we also found a continued focus on commercial timber species. Even though I showed you that pine had decreased, we still find a lot of what they're planting is pine and deodar, these commercial species, a few other commercial species. They are not planting any of many of the species that are most valued by local people for their livelihoods. And I mentioned the native oak. I think we found that they planted a few thousand native oak out of millions of trees that they planted in this time period. So a lot of the global enthusiasm for tree planting stems from the perception that there's a lot of positive co-benefits for tree planting and for forest restoration more generally for local people. Conversely, if you read the Indian environmental media, you'll find a lot of reports that these tree plantings are actually causing human rights violations. People are being removed from their homes, their fields are being bulldozed in order to create plantations to achieve these national goals of planting. So we wanted to look at this. We interviewed thousands of households, 2,400 households in our study area to find out how they were using the plantations and how they were affecting them. Our results are a lot more equivocal than either of these stories would tell you. The reason, this is a generally well-off area. Compared to the rest of India, if you go to this area, it looks well off. You can see in this photograph of a typical home, there's an old stone-roofed mud hut that maybe is where these people used to live. Now it's kind of falling apart, but it's being used for keeping animals. And they've built a nice modern brick home, and they look fairly prosperous. Salaried employment and remittance income from people who've moved to the cities or have government jobs elsewhere in India is a major source of income for many households in this study area. In particular, maybe in part because this is pretty close to the border with Pakistan and fairly close to the border with China, there's a lot of people who are serving in the military from these villages. So you'll find a lot of people, a man in his 50s might be a pensioner from the military, and a family might have a son who's serving in the military and sending money home. So people just aren't that forest dependent. On the other hand, we find that most households are still using forests either for gathering firewood for heating and cooking. And I want to point out, firewood is used throughout South Asia for cooking, but this is also a landscape. It's up in the mountains. It's fairly far north. It does get pretty chilly for several months in the winter. And people also use firewood just for heating their homes, heating bath water so they can take a bath when it's cold. And many households are still keeping livestock, and they're either grazing them in the forest areas or common areas that are being targeted for afforestation, or they're gathering fodder in those areas and bringing them home to stall feed their animals. So most households are still using the forests, but the share of their income and well-being that's based on the forest is pretty small. So the impacts are fairly modest. Some people are more vulnerable. So we did a small study, which is published in Ecology and Society last year, where we interviewed a large number, qualitative interviews, not our 2,400 household sample survey, with migratory herders. These people are from the Gadi tribe, which is a traditional sheep and goat herding, predominantly sheep herding tribe that move the goats up and down the mountains. So in the summer, they're grazing them in alpine pastures. In winter, they may be taking their animals down into the plains of India and grazing them on stubble and in rice and wheat fields. And the Gadi households actually live and have farms in the middle elevations. And for part of the year, they're actually farming as well. That's sort of the traditional Gadi livelihood. And we found that they complain a lot about plantations. They say, well, we want to move our animals up and down through the hills, and we find our routes are blocked because someone's built a plantation and they fence it, and we can't move our animals through these government plantations. We also can't access the grass that used to be there because they're fenced out, and eventually the grass gets shaded out. So Gadis were frustrated about livelihoods, about plantations. But again, Gadis are complicated. Gadi migratory herding is declining for many reasons. Plantations are one of many reasons why their migratory lifestyles are declining. Maybe the most important being a lot of Gadis have gotten educations and have gotten outside employment. And if you ask most people, do you want to live in a tent in harsh conditions and hike up and down steep mountains all day? Or do you want a comfortable salaried job where you sit in a comfortable office all day? Well, some of us are romantic and say, oh, I think it would be really fun to be a herder. But here I am with a comfortable salaried job. And like me, most Guddies are when they have access to it, prefer to get their children educated, to have their children try for those employments. So although these lifestyles are declining, we actually found that many of these Guddies are doing quite well. They're well off. They're better off maybe than they were when they were migratory herders. So this is a complicated story about both vulnerability and opportunity. A key piece of the story that I want to emphasize is access to education in the state is very high. If these people were living in a place where it was hard for tribal communities to get educated, which probably describes most of India, we might not see such nice outcomes for them. They might be having problems with plantations and not able to recover. So I think in some senses, this is a discouraging story because we're saying, well, the government has been doing all these plantations and they failed. So we have a paper under review, another paper under review, another paper that we just submitted revisions on, in which we tried to look more closely at individual plantations and say, well, where are the plantations where we're seeing win-win outcomes, where in spite of the average being that there's not really an effect on livelihoods and there isn't really an effect on forest growth, some plantations we see improved forest growth and improvements in livelihoods. So let's look at what determines that. I should say the most common outcome in our data set is improvements in forest cover without any improvement in livelihoods. So again, the idea that forest cover is good for people, we're actually finding that that's often not the case. But in some cases it is, so we wanted to look more closely at the common characteristics. And we found that this was happening in villages where there was more collective action and where there was a moderate number of local groups active in the village. So we found when there were very few local groups, it wasn't as good. And when there were a very large number of local groups might mean a village self-help group or a caste association, any sort of group that our informants, the 40 informants in each village we talked to, belong to in their village. But this sort of medium number of groups, it seemed to be associated with better outcomes. And this is actually, I can go in the Q&A, this is consistent with, there's a fair bit of literature that suggests that this is not surprising. And we also found that communities that had more resources and where off-farm employment was greater were more likely to have these win-win outcomes. All right. So why are we seeing generally disappointing outcomes from these forest restoration programs in India? Well, this is described in more detail in a paper that was actually part of my doctoral dissertation. But I think we can find some answers in looking at the public administrators themselves. So as I keep mentioning, these are government-run plantations on government land. And they are promoting tree planting because it justifies the existence of public forestry agencies. In fact, if you're familiar with India, there's a lot of negativity directed towards public forestry agencies, which are seen as part of a history of British colonialism, of divorcing local ownership, destroying local institutions, and putting power in the hands of a colonial state. And many people don't like this. But tree planting is something the government can do that sort of, they can say, well, this is something that's good for everyone. We're improving livelihoods. We're helping people adapt to climate. We're storing carbon. We're improving water provision. And this belief is widespread in India, not just among government officials, but I interviewed politicians and local people, and they would all sort of have this discourse about the benefits of tree planting. So planting trees is a way that it looks like you're doing something good. It's also been a way to attract international donor funding, not just domestic funding. Although at this point in India, domestic funding really swamps out donor funding in terms of its importance for tree planting. And we can talk about CAMPA and its role in that, but there's a national law that's putting a lot of money into tree planting in India. So this is being promoted without a lot of attention to detail. It is true that forests have some benefit for water provision, but it's very complicated. I've never met a forest official in India who talked to me about the complications that sometimes if you plant a forest in a watershed, yes, sometimes you might lead to rejuvenation of old springs, but sometimes there might be less water because of more evapotranspiration. It depends on the local circumstances, but that doesn't seem to be understood or promoted. There's also a very simplified public management scheme where local officials, forestry officials, are held accountable for the number of trees that are planted, but they're not held accountable for having beneficial outcomes in the long run. So oftentimes it doesn't matter where you plant your trees or whether your trees survive. It just matters that you planted the requisite number. Maybe it matters if they survive for a few months, so when your supervisor visits, they can see that you actually planted the trees. But it doesn't matter what happens 2, 3, 5, 10 years out. And in fact, we found, as I mentioned before, there's a significant portion of planting going on in places that probably just doesn't make sense. And we think this is just being driven by a local official received a target and they said, you have to plant 10,000 trees in your area. And this person just went out and found whatever places they could fit a sapling and didn't worry too much about whether it was really an appropriate thing to be doing. Finally, I want to point out that biophysical limitations are interacting with these administrative ones. Planting these trees requires raising a sapling for 2 years in a nursery before you plant it. So there's a lot of long-term planning. One of the big obstructions to genuine joint management in schemes like joint forest management is they say, we go into the village and we talk to the villagers about what they want. They all say they want ban oak, which is, as I've mentioned, a very beneficial local species. But we don't have any ban oak ready to plant. This village is scheduled for planting this year. We didn't raise any ban oak 2 years ago, so we don't have any. You guys get cheer pine instead. And it turns out that it's hard to propagate some of these species. The government really knows how to grow cheer pine in the nursery. They don't know how to grow ban oak. So they don't plant very much of it, even though probably in a lot of these systems, it would be the best tree to plant. I think we can look at some alternative explanations coming from a political ecology perspective. So as I mentioned before, forest property rights in India are held by a colonially rooted government agency. The British came to India in the 1860s. They began taking land rights away from local communities, investing them in a state-run forest department. And this pattern was continued in the post-colonial era, continues to this day. And we find that even when there have been attempts made to ameliorate this government control through programs like joint forest management, national level program, we find that local participation tends to be quite limited, and government agencies don't really engage with and involve local people. And this may explain why we didn't find any outcomes between plantations that had a joint forest management kind of approach and those that did not. Local people often resist unwanted interference in land near their communities. So if the government comes in and says, we're going to put a plantation here, they didn't really consult with the local people, or the consultation wasn't very genuine. And the local people may say, we don't want this here. And then some hot day in May when it's hot and dry, maybe some farmer or herder walks by and drops his cigarette in the grass next to that planted field. and the dry grass starts to burn and it burns down that plantation. And it's not that anyone was doing arson to do it. It's just that the community wasn't invested in caring for it. Or maybe, in fact, it was an arson attempt to resist that plantation. So because of this system of inequality, we don't, power inequality, we don't see local people really engaged in a lot of these plantation programs. We do see improvements in plantation programs when local communities organize resistance and demand changes. We found that in some of the villages, and we have a working paper on this, and some of the villages we visited, there was a history of people organizing to demand a change in how the government plantations were working around them. And they were able to push the government agencies, not through joint forest management, but through political organizing, to do something different. And in fact, on a macro scale, we think this is why, a major reason why the pine plantation declined in this area, is that there were actual movements in the 1990s and 2000s where organized groups of people across many villages were going to the state government and saying, plant less pine in our forests. We don't want all this pine around our village. Eucalyptus planting was tried for a time in Himachal, I think in the 1970s actually. And again, it was abandoned because local people didn't want it. And again, that was a result of a political movement. It wasn't the result of a formal power sharing arrangement. Finally, if you look at this picture on the bottom of a farm in our study area, you'll notice that it's full of trees. So what's happening there? Well, unfortunately, we didn't design this into our study, so I don't have a ton of data, but I will tell you anecdotally that people plant tons of trees on their farms around their homes. They're mostly fruit trees or other trees with very direct uses. And this is happening on private lands autonomously without government control because people find it beneficial. They have the capital. Many people, as I said, this is a very well off area relative to India, and people have the capital to invest in growing trees where they want them. So we can imagine a world in which tree planting is driven by these local demands and needs, and we might see much better outcomes for local people. I do want to bracket off that I think that there's a trade-off between the kind of fruit-growing agroforestry that you see on this farm and forest plantations or forest restoration that's aiming towards more natural systems. Probably those fruit trees will never store the same amount of carbon or have the same kinds of biodiversity as a natural forest or a plantation or a forest. On the other hand, they might be much, much, much more useful to the local people. And there may be a trade-off there. So I want to back up, and I said, well, at the beginning, this is a talk about what happens when we ignore the social science. So the social science in India has been saying for decades what I just said. When local people have ownership, the forest outcomes are better. Government-run colonial and post-colonial forest programs are not good for people and often cause problems. So I could have said that in 1995, or even I've read things in the early 1980s that were saying the same thing. So I think that the bottom line is that restoration programs can be beneficial for people, but they can also be very costly for people if they're not designed well, if we don't think about their relationship to local needs and local institutional structures. The failures that we're seeing in these programs are partially biophysical failures. The tree didn't grow, and oftentimes maybe the tree didn't grow because it wasn't planted in an appropriate place. But it's also failing because it's not grounding these forest restoration programs in the social fabric of people's needs in these communities. Unfortunately, to this day, I don't think we have a systematic understanding of what it means for people to do to implement ecological restoration. When I read international papers, big international analyses about restoration, they seem so disconnected from what happens on the ground with these government-run ecological restoration programs in India. And I've spoken about this with the few policy makers and scientists working in this sort of global restoration world. And there's just a very large disconnect between what I see happening and what these people are imagining might happen in India as a result of their work. I don't think we have a systematic understanding of the impacts of ecological restoration on people. There are a few review papers out there that have looked at this. There's a Finnish group, the lead author is Malcolm Maki, and I don't speak Finnish, I'm probably butchering his name. It was published in Global Environmental Change a few years ago. They found very disparate outcomes and didn't have good explanations for those disparate outcomes. I don't think we understand how people's engagement influences the social and ecological impacts of restoration. And this means we don't have a good idea of how ecological restoration can be made more just, effective, and sustainable. And I think this is a really big problem for this global agenda that I outlined at the beginning of my talk. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk. If you're interested in engaging more, I have the URL of this for this mailing list that we've just created for further discussion on this topic. This is what I'm going to be working on for the next decade, and I need help, so I can't do it all myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Forrest. Absolutely fascinating. I'm sure it's generated lots of questions and debate that we'll turn to now. So I'd like to open up to the floor for questions, and feel free to switch on your cameras again now. It's quite nice if you like to see some faces in the audience, whether we're asking questions or not. While people are thinking of questions, either just raise your hand or pop it in the chat, and I can see you and forward them and direct them and invite you to speak directly to Forrest. Just while we're getting the first few questions, I wanted to just pick up on a point of clarification that slightly confused me. You said since the mid-80s, commercial planting, harvesting is not allowed anymore. And yet you were describing plantations that, so the primary purpose of these plantations is local goods and services and watershed protection. And yet you were describing plantations that were fenced off from local people. So what's the rationale for this private exclusion of these forests when they're meant to be for local goods and services? How is that justified?
Well, I actually think, I mean, you know, one of the major causes of young tree mortality in this landscape is grazing animals. So I think that the justification, which I think makes sense, is if we don't fence this off, these trees are just going to get eaten by goats or cows. So even though it's for benefits, to think about the long-term benefits, we've got to restrict those benefits for 10 years so that we can make this investment in growth. Okay. And I think that is probably pretty reasonable. And I will say that they do, typically what they do is they auction the right to harvest the grass that's growing between the trees. So someone will go in there, you know, the trees are 2 years old and they're only, you know, 1 meter or 2 meters. They're not shading out the grass. So we go in there and someone cuts the grass and sells it as fodder. And so in that sense, there's still sort of a multiple use that can happen in that context.
Great, thanks, Phil. I think that makes sense. Okay, any questions from the audience? So I think Shyam, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Thanks for a nice insight about these Indian plantations. I'm being a forestry graduate and done my PhD from FRI Dehradun, and being a seed ecologist and being from the Himalaya, I know a lot of these in depth, and I spent my whole childhood in Almora district of Uttarakhand. And a lot of our grazing ground was converted by not only the Roxburghi cheer pine forest, also in the Caribbean pine and the Pinus patula. And there's a two more things. Why they are the forest officer preferring the pine, Devdar. Then you talk about the Rubinia and then Khair acacia.
Yeah.
Because the Rubinia and Khair is easy to grow, easy to propagate because they are a physical dormant seeds. Pine is, you grow pine everywhere. They grow very fast. They give the return very fast in terms of that they want to say, okay, this year we have a target for, let's say, 50,000 plantations in that much of the hectare, and they can sow it. Second, they devote the local people from their right for the fodder. If you look the Uttarakhand, we have a Panchayati forest.
Yeah.
Uttarakhand is very famous for the Panchayati forest or village forest, community forest. The community forest is not burned for the several years, and then government forest burn every year, because the Panchayati forest is owned and governed by the local community.
Yeah.
That's the reason it is gone. And you pointed out well, the colonial mindset, it's still keeping the forest department and the local people away from each other. And it is really very interesting to see how these, why they are not growing the oak and other native species. They are not knowing how to grow them.
Yeah.
And they know how to store, because the oak seed has a very short viability and have a physiological dormancy. They don't want to grow that kind of the seed which need a longer time to break the dormancy and which is short-lived in nature. That's a reason not growing the native species.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've also worked in central India, though not this project. And I found in parts of central India, there was a lot of investment. They were planting a lot of, I think, well, they call it Pongamia. I think that's been reclassified.
Pongama pinnata.
Yeah, and I was talking to them, why are you planting this? And one of the reasons was, it's the only thing we found that goats won't eat. So it'll grow. But the flip side of that is, that means kind of by definition, it's not that useful to local people because they can't feed the fodder from it to their animals. So there is some genuine trade-off between something that will grow and then something that's useful to people. But I think that in this oak versus pine, clearly the oaks are so much more appropriate for the goals of these programs that it would be worth investing in. Let's figure out how to propagate this species at a large scale. And we know historically, going back to the early Britishers, foresters, they couldn't figure out they spent years trying to figure out how to grow teak. Teak was hard to propagate at first, and then they figured it out.
Yeah. Now the oak, they are penetrating the oak, even the foothills of the Himalaya, which is not a good area because it is frost sensitive. But they are growing the teak, which is not suitable for the teak now even.
I see a lot of questions in the chat, but I haven't been able to follow them.
Yeah, I'll direct them, don't worry. Okay, Bernie, you have a comment or question?
Well, yes. Hi, Forrest. This is Bernie from your PhD committee. So the question I had is, you're doing a great work in India. How do you set up a network of looking at these projects across developed and undeveloped, developing countries over time that asks even better questions on our broader landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bernie. And I would say I don't think we figured that out yet. Yeah. I think the first thing is talking to people who, I do a little bit in Mexico and talking to people who work in other parts of the world. I've been talking a lot to people who work in Brazil and China. Each place is pretty different.
Yes.
So I think one of the important things that we're learning just very informally is, we want to push this global agenda, but it's really going to have a lot of local thought about what is appropriate and what will work in any given context, because the in Brazil, most of the afforestation is happening on private ranches. In India, it's mostly happening on government-run land. The issues are just really different. So just that issue, forget the biophysical differences. Just that issue means you're going to have to follow a different strategy. And we studied one district in India. It took us 5 years, and we had a $750,000 grant from NASA. So, thinking about scaling that up, what I'm really thinking is we need a lot of different people working in a lot of different places, and then building up through case studies and case comparisons to understand, well, why did this work in this context? What about this configuration of variables it made this project work in this place? And what about that can be applied to another place? And it's not necessarily going to be a linear transformation. And I think this is analogous to older work that you were part of training me in on, what makes common pool resource management work in different parts of the world. Well, it looks different, but eventually we were able to figure out some common principles that apply in many places.
Yeah. And just to follow up, I mean, you're working in afforestation,
yeah,
rather than forested areas we're trying to either protect or reforest. So your focus is just afforestation, which is a big question in its own right. But it even gets bigger when you start talking about reforestation or protecting forest land.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I think that the afforestation, reforestation is a little confusing here, because probably most of these places were forested not that long ago, but we don't always know.
Yeah.
And so that's a little confusing, but I think the point is very valid. And thinking about where I've worked in Mexico, where it's mostly shifting cultivation, and the challenge of reforesting there is very different, and I think is being misunderstood in its own way, because it's being treated as afforestation by some government agencies, whereas in fact those are shifting cultivation landscapes that have been cultivated that way for thousands of years. Thank you, Bernie.
Thank you. Okay, Matthew Fagan has a question. He can't unmute, so I'll read it out to you. If you had to guess at the relative tree cover area of natural forests versus trees around houses versus plantations in your study area, what would it be?
Well, okay, so I think the trees around houses is probably a pretty small percentage of the total tree coverage, maybe 5 or 10%. It is significant, but it's both sparse and I think a smaller area. I mean, people still do have big rice paddies and other agricultural fields that aren't covered in trees. Now I've forgotten the number. I think that the total area afforested, according to the government records we have, is about half of the total forest cover. But a lot of afforestation fails, as we showed in our paper. So we don't really know what percentage of the forest cover is derived from planting versus derived from natural systems. And that was a question I hoped we would be able to answer, but I don't really feel confident in anything we've been able to do to try to get at that. My guess is that it's probably something, and you definitely go through places where everything looks like a cheer pine plantation. And it's like, well, I'm in a forest area, but I'm really just in plantations. But you go through other areas where the forest looks like, well, this is probably a natural forest that's been managed in various ways for hundreds of years, but is not derived from planting. And probably maybe that's 2/3 of the forest in this landscape.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, and Connie, you have a question there about Glasgow.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Forrest. It was an excellent talk. You'd mentioned Glasgow in the beginning of your talk, and that you had some thoughts on the new pledges and promises coming out of that. And I was really interested to hear what effect you think these might have. I mean, including, I guess, pledges relating directly to restoration. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's also the Glasgow pledge to end and halt and reverse deforestation and land degradation by 2030, which is quite ambitious. So among the things I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on are, you know, what do you see the effects of sort of increasing ambition to meet very ambitious targets around forests, and how that might affect the way that people go about restoration or basically their strategies in addressing forest cover. And also, I noticed that India is not listed as one of the countries that joined the over 100 countries forest pledge that promised to halt deforestation by 2030. So do you know why that is? I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts there too.
I don't know the answer to that last question. India is officially not experiencing a lot of deforestation, although there are some analyses out there that say, well, they're just replacing it because they do so much plantation forestry. It looks like forest cover is stable, but what they're doing is they're losing natural forests and replacing it with plantation forests. But I think I'm very concerned with these large-scale pledges because of what I've seen in India, and to some extent what we see going on in Mexico as well, which is when we make these large-scale pledges, we tend to scale up these really big, really ambitious initiatives, and then when that filters down to the level of the person who has to choose where to plant trees, someone told him you got to plant 10,000 trees this year, and he can't figure out where, so he just plants them in a place that's already forested, or he plants them in a place where they're obviously not going to grow, which is what we see repeatedly happening in this landscape. And so I tend to read those as pledges to waste a lot of money. And the actual work of figuring out how to do reforestation is pretty challenging. And the target-based approach might be missing the key interventions. So Ruth de Vries has a paper that I think came out this year in Biotropica, or maybe it's last year, where she looks at the effect basically of a government program to give everyone LPG canisters in central India, and shows that it had a really big positive effect on forest restoration. So people are saying, well, we're gonna recover this much area. Well, the focus on recovering the area might be the wrong thing. It might be, what are the things that are enable people to shift to a restoration world? And maybe one of those is needing less firewood, because I haven't, and that's, I mean, that's an interesting paper in part because I think the effect is not universal, and there's plenty of studies that show different effects from giving people alternative fuels. But in that landscape, that worked really well. And in other landscapes, it might be something else. And, you know, I think there's a really interesting conversation going on that we're trying to look at in the Himalayas about outmigration, and whether it leads to rural outmigration, whether it leads to forest recovery or not. But these things might be the key things that matter, and they're not necessarily amenable to thinking about in terms of a target of X hectares that we're going to reforest in our country. And when we focus on that, we tend to do things like, well, we're going to fence off this area, or we're going to plant trees here, which may or may not be the most effective interventions in that landscape, and often are not the most cost effective, even if they work.
Okay, thank you, Connie. Okay. Paulina and Manfred, you have a question?
Yeah, Manfred Fink, University of Hamburg. I'm ecologist. Yeah, thanks for this nice talk. I know very similar stories from Morocco, for example, where as well forestry is done in a colonial mindset and not necessarily to the benefit of the people. My question was more, it was a story about afforestation and plantation, but you used the terms restoration, afforestation and plantation, all three. For me, restoration is much more oriented to the original ecosystems. And but you showed this case study as an example how problematic restoration is. But I think very little of it was about restoration, and most of it was about plantation. And shouldn't we be more precise with terminology and trying to differentiate between ecosystem restoration and putting trees everywhere, just for looking for a higher tree cover? I think that's something very different from restoration.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, but I'm going to push back on it and say I've repeatedly heard from restoration ecologists, well, what you're studying isn't restoration. And my answer is restoration, whenever restoration doesn't work, restoration ecologists say, oh, but that wasn't restoration. If you look at the goals of these programs, the goal of the program is restoration. This is how countries like India do restoration. So
I would say
I agree with you that it's not really restoration. But when we're talking about this in sort of a global policy context, this is what restoration means in much of the world. So I agree. We should if we're making normative recommendations about how we should do restoration, I don't think what I see the typical pattern of tree planting in India is not restoration. On the other side, if we're looking at, say, a global pledge to restore, the Bond Challenge, we're going to restore 350 million hectares. This is what this is what India is going to do with their Bond Challenge. And Ida Janontan, who just finished her PhD at Michigan State, had a nice paper in environmental management last year that made a similar point with I think 6 countries in Africa that she looked at. And the paper is called something like Restoration as It Is. And she looks at these restoration programs that say they're doing restoration. And then she looks at what they actually do. And they just plant a bunch of, whatever tree is easy to propagate in rows on the landscape. So this is a complicated linguistic thing to talk about.
Yeah, but I think we should be very clear that calling plantation forestry restoration is a kind of greenwashing the
absolutely
misapplied forestry concept.
Yeah, I think that's very valid, and so but I also want to be clear that when we talk about these restoration pledges and big national things that people say they're going to restore, this is often what they're actually going to be doing.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. I just wanted to make the point that we as ecologists should be quite explicit about it, that it's not restoration.
Yeah, I know, for example, my colleague Natalie said in another set of paper on nature-based solutions that also define nature-based solutions as things that have positive biodiversity outcomes, and the monoculture plantations are not nature-based solutions as well, but they often are considered in the wider discussions that are considered restoration, ecological restoration.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is a difference between a normative concept, which is what I hear from ecologists. Here's what restoration should be, and an empirical concept. When people say they're doing restoration, this is what they do.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll read one out from my student, my PhD student Trisha, who's on a train, and she's very keen to chat to you afterwards. So I'm sure she'll reach out to you. Are there any prospects of doing similar work, looking at natural regeneration areas, maybe including different tenure rights, including community forests?
Yeah, we've been talking about doing this in 2 ways. First of all, in Kangra district, there is they have forest cooperatives, which are sort of like the Van Panchayats that someone referred to in the neighboring state of Uttarakhand. Excuse me. And so we've been talking about looking specifically at these cooperative forests, which are managed very differently, and seeing what the outcomes are from regeneration programs. A very small percentage of our sites fell in cooperative forests. They're not the dominant land tenure system there. And we're also talking about trying to look more comparatively across India, including, for example, I've heard a lot of reports about natural regeneration and community forestry in Orissa. And I've never even been to Orissa, but thinking about comparing what's going on there to what's going on here, and also thinking about a place I lived for a long time years ago, Kerala is a place where there's a lot of agroforestry, and that's another form of forest cover increase, but it's driven by a very different land tenure system and very different kinds of incentives. And we're trying to think about how to put something together to look at that in a comparative context. We're not there yet.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Trisha. Andy, again, you have a question.
Yeah, hi Forrest, thanks very much for that great presentation. I'm head of conservation policy at the Woodland Trust in the UK, and also a director of Fellowship of the Trees, community interest company. And I've done a lot of work on community-led forestry in Africa in the past. So I'm really enthusiastic about what you've said, and certainly some of the research that you've done in India chimes with the experience I had working with local community-led forestry initiatives in Africa. And I suppose the question I've got is how, and listening to all the things about the big targets and how they often lead to the wrong solutions. And that's clear what you talk about the bond challenge and the AFR 100, which is Africa's contribution to that. Research that was done by Global Forest Coalition showed that about 45% of the planned new forest cover is monoculture plantations. So they're doing, they're kind of retracing the kind of colonial top-down model. The two groups that seem to be missing, that most need to be part of these conversations and decisions, are ecologists and local communities. Yeah. So I suppose my question, and I'm also noting that I think 36% of the world's old growth forests and intact forests are protected and maintained and sustainably looked after by Indigenous and First Nation communities. And we don't really seem to be, I don't know how much research is taking place to really learn from their success. I mean, they are the kind of ecologists and local communities who have this sort of biocultural approach with engaging with the natural world that leads to good intact forest as part of a healthy ecosystem. So I'm kind of wondering how we get the right people making the decisions.
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. I mean, I think the first thing I'll say is, if we go back, the history of the last 20 years of global policy making, there's been this idea that that forest restoration is a cheap way to store carbon. And the Stern Review, whenever that was, 15 years ago, sort of flagged this as like, well, this is the cheapest way we can store carbon. And I'm not an economist, and I don't do those kind of comparisons. But to me, it's very expensive. First of all, because it requires a lot of work. Someone has to spend a lot of time working with these local communities to figure out what those needs that they have are, and how that translates and interacts with a global goal of having more forest carbon. That's expensive work. It's not necessarily expensive in terms of money, but it takes someone who builds those relationships and has that knowledge. And that is essentially expensive to do. And there's also a great deal of uncertainty in whether you're going to be successful at it. So my joke is that, I compare it to if I installed a heat pump on my house and replaced my gas furnace. I actually live in a place that's still too cold for a heat pump to really work year round. But if I lived in a place that was a little bit warmer, I could replace my gas furnace with a heat pump, and there'd be a well-defined decrease in the amount of energy I would consume, and depending on where my electricity comes from. Whereas with these forest things, we just don't know if we're even going to be able to do it until we spend a decade trying to do it. So I think that the key issue is who has the decision-making rights. And I think that, where local communities have decision-making rights, even if those are limited and regulated, which I think is maybe reasonable that they might be limited and regulated, that's where we're going to be able to get the local community voices and make sure they're heard. And what we've seen around the world with forestry decentralization programs for the last 25 years is where they don't have real rights, they often are just ignored. So to me, that's really crucial. And then a second thing I see is that there was a big investment made under RED in monitoring and reporting verification systems for national government forestry agencies. And there's still a big emphasis on this sort of jurisdictional level investment in technical knowledge. But a lot of that doesn't, at least in the context of India, where I've been looking at it, it doesn't filter down into actually having people on the ground understand what it takes to do things. So I still find there's a big gap between these sort of ambitions. You know, now India has, you know, when I first started working in India, no one knew how to measure carbon. Now there's lots of forest officials who know how to measure carbon in India, but they still don't know how to change. And that's going to the title of my talk, in part because change is a social scientific phenomenon, not a biophysical phenomenon.
Okay, thank you, Andy. There's a few questions in the chat, but as we're running to about half an hour now on the Q&A, I think it's probably a good time to wrap up the Q&A. But I think the number of questions reflects how enthusiastic our audience is and how fascinating your seminar and your work has been. So thank you for making time to talk to us, Forrest, and you're pointing to some really interesting papers coming out in the next few months and years. So we'll keep an eye out for them as I look forward to reading them. We have a tradition in this seminar series to unmute at the end and give an audible round of applause to our virtual audience. So
thank you, everyone, and I'll be happy to be in touch about any of these issues if people didn't get their questions answered or want to have further discussions. And I think I put in the chat that group that I'm trying to create for discussions about this. That would be so far it's kind of nascent, it's an idea, but I hope that people will consider joining.
Great, thank you. And this recording will be posted onto YouTube and we'll tweet it out. So either if you follow Forrest on Twitter, I'm sure they'll be tweeting it out everywhere as well. So and do come and join our seminar next week on sustainable forestry and its effectiveness, and or join our seminar series next term. So thank you again, Forrest, and everyone have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.